Welcome to Navigating Change, everyone, the podcast from Teibel Inc. My name is Pete Wright, and thank you so much for joining us. What you are about to hear is part 3 of a conversation in progress between Howard Teibel and yours truly on uncovering your why and the robust decision-making process that Howard has been using with his clients as it has evolved over the years. It's a great conversation. In episode 1, if you missed it, make sure you go back and catch it. It was episode 25 of the podcast where we talked about these foundational elements of the visioning process. Part 2 of this conversation was episode 26 last week, where we talked about brainstorming and the importance of strong leadership in this process. And this week we wrap it up with a conversation on making the transition from brainstorming and ideation into strategic management and day-to-day operations. Thank you again so much for keeping up with this conversation. Again, episodes 25 and 26 of Navigating Change. You'll find parts 1 and 2 of this conversation. We encourage you to go back and check those out, just so you don't miss any holes in the conversation. Again, thanks so much. And now, part 3 of Uncovering Your Why. I had one last question before we wrap up, because this is one of our longer conversations, but I think it's important, is this idea of how you may move, how you decide to move from that judgment step to assigning responsibility. What are the, to me, there's a gut check piece that says, if you're in a particular quadrant of your matrix, it makes it pretty easy to say, this item needs to go to the board, and they're going to need to keep their eye on this over the next 3 years because it's a particularly strategic item. Are there any sort of rules of thumb that you apply when you're actually assigning responsibilities versus and making the determination between tactical versus strategic operational issues?
Well, I used it based on sort of this idea of short-term versus long-term.
Okay.
Is the problem you're trying to solve, to me, it's very simply, if those items that are urgent and important fall in that quadrant we need to focus on. These are the short-term things and that's where, these are the things that are most familiar to people. This is the area that people get stuck often, is we got too much stuff to do. So in terms of rules of thumb, I don't have necessarily a rule of thumb for this, but I think that what the person in charge needs to do, or the group needs to do, is to step back and, as you said, basically say, did we capture everything? Is there any other way of looking at this that we haven't considered? And then basically saying, we got it. I mean, I think 9 times out of 10, the kinds of decisions we need to make, and I'm putting aside, by the way, metrics that are important in this process, really being able to say, well, what does the data tell us? Which is another whole, some initiatives require data to help make a decision. Others don't, right? So if I'm dealing with an issue around net revenue, I want to understand all the elements that are contributing. Where are our costs? Where are the revenue, the gross revenue, and how do we think about what we should be doing more of or less of? We need that data to help identify the problem. But there's other kinds of decisions that are really trusting your gut and saying, this is what we want to move forward. And if you've got a team, if you're in charge of a team, you just need to know that your team in the end is waiting for you to say, all right, good, this has been fantastic. Let's now move on. This is what I want to do. Or this is what I'd like to do. What do you guys think? And you've got to be willing to move that ball off of this process of problem defining and getting the why to, all right, we understand it. Here's what we're going to do. Come back to me with a plan. And that kind of leadership requires thinking in 2 ways. One, in the stepping back and having patience and letting a team really deconstruct something, and then being willing to then step in and say, all right, we're done. It's time to move on. How are we going to implement this? And too often I find that the leader has 1 or 2 biases. They just want the answer, and there's no time for reflection, or there's all this reflection and there's not enough being directive.
Right.
You need both.
You need both.
So we sort of transition. What's interesting
Yeah.
is we transitioned from a decision-making model to, from a people standpoint, how do you actually move this through a process? And more in my work, my experience is around, you need the designated person in charge, or a person that the group identifies or is willing to say is in charge, to move the process forward, and that they're given the trust to do it. Now, sometimes the trust is given because they're the authority and they have legal authority because they're in charge. And other times it's because they've got great influence and they're respected, and the group will give them that permission. So, the two conversations we've talked about here is the process for decision making, but then the key for someone to be paying attention to where you are in the process and what are we going to do now about it.
Well, yeah, I think that's the observation I was coming to too. That particularly when you overlay one on top of the other, there are few obvious gates for when you have finished one stage and need to move on to the next of this decision-making process. And too often when you see a model, you are looking for obvious gates. How can a gate make my decision-making process easier? And that's not what we're talking about here.
Well, actually, there is a gate. The gate is in language. The gate is looking around the room when there's a pause in the discussion and saying, have we effectively captured the why?
Well, and that's what I mean. I don't think that's an obvious gate. I think that's what takes a leader with some experience and practice at doing this to make those observations.
But again, what's interesting is, if you think about it, I've trained myself to think that way. There are internal leaders that have been through this process, and you can learn pretty easily to step back from the content and then say, all right, are we ready to move on to the brainstorming? Are we ready to move on to refinement? You're right, it's not obvious, but it can be learned. It's basically making it conscious that you have to own moving people through this.
When you're not ready, when your instinctive response is to ask the group, so what do you think? We ready to move on to the next step? Right? I mean, how many meetings have you been a part of in your career? That's kind of the gate, and that's the one I'm thinking of. It's the office space gate,
Yeah, for me, it's when I will say, did we capture the why?
Yeah.
I actually am privately thinking that we did capture the why.
Yeah.
But it's not for
you need
me
the group to
agree decide that.
Yeah. Yep. This is good. This is so good. I'm gonna. We need to put a fork in it. This is a great conversation, and I think we'll be talking more about these topics in the future. But for now, this is a fantastic way to kick this one off. And we'll post the. It's okay, right? We'll post the graphic that we've kind of been working through on the website under this episode. I believe it's episode 25. You can look for episode 25 for the show notes on teibelinc.com. And, make sure you subscribe to the show in iTunes. It's a great way to subscribe, to make sure you don't miss a single episode of Navigating Change. And while you're there, if you have an extra second to visit the ratings and reviews section in iTunes and give us a rating or a comment, let us know what you're thinking. Let us know how you listen to the show and what you think of the topics. If you have ideas, we sure would love to hear them. And thank you so much, everybody. On behalf of Howard Teibel, I'm Pete Wright, and we'll catch you next time on Navigating Change, the podcast from Teibel Inc.